Are you ready to manage your work and personal world better to live a more fulfilling, productive life? Then you've come to the right place. Welcome to ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity. Here are your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.
So last time we got together, we were discussing about the different, tools and hardware, pieces of hardware we have, the Windows, the Macs, the iPads, the tablets, and everything else. But I wanted to continue the discussion into how to choose, because Francis, I know it's on a Windows machine. I am mostly on an iPad and, have access to a Mac if I need to. But it hasn't always been like that, and it has changed over the years, and have jumped from the Mac to the PC to the Mac and different things. So it doesn't matter which operating system you are for the 90% of the thing. You can go Chromebooks and be okay, iPad and be okay, Windows and be okay, and then the Mac, you keep onto those four, and even Linux, into those 5 operating systems, you can really do 90%, and now it's a matter of software specific that will limit a matter of capability. It's less and less these days. So I'm curious how we choose which hardware to use, and what are those criteria that we have for the hardware we use, and what we will recommend people, when they need to choose a different kind of hardware.
And we have with us our regular contributor, Francis Wade. Francis, how are you today?
I'm great. Pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. So, as the lead-in talked about, we're going to be talking about hardware choices, and it's as a continuation of our conversation last week.
Before my first computer, if I go really, really back, was an Apple Macintosh.
Tandy 2 here.
Mine wasn't. We are not. I don't know. I may need to research what kind of computer was that. That was not available on my time. That was not available on my time. I really don't know what kind of machine is that. But the first computer that made it home was an Apple Macintosh. That's what started my thing. I went from there to a PC and went through the different pains of being a Windows user. 2007, I decided it was time to go back to the Mac. I was at that time a PC user, but I really did not enjoy my computing experience, so I wanted something better. So I decided to test a MacBook, and I really fell in love with the fact that it works. When I did that change, a good friend of mine came to have dinner with us at home, and he asked, "So how is the Mac?" Because he was really curious. He wanted to do the same. And before I could answer, my wife said, "Oh, it's great." Everybody on the dinner table looked at her like, "How do you know?" And she said, "Oh, it's great. Now he go into his home office and he don't shout. Before you used to hear all these awful words coming from the office. I'm going to throw you to the window, you beep." Okay, that was a change that the Mac brought for me. It was more a machine that works for what I needed to do. Not perfect by any means, but it was a machine where I could be much more productive and much more relaxed. And for that reason, I really like the platform. But at that time, I was heavy road warrior. I was traveling over 250,000 miles a year. On 2010, when the iPad was announced, I look, for what I did, I look at the iPad and I say, with the current version as it was, with all their limitations in 2010, I can probably get rid of half of the gear on my bag. And in fact, I did. Pages at that time was not as powerful. Numbers at that time was not as powerful. But I could get by for 90% of the stuff, and instead of carry that much weight, I turned myself into a super light bag that even with the standards of battery at that time, I could last most of the day, and if not, it was a piece of cake to carry the charger with me. And the more I work on the iPad, with again their difficulties, I fall in love with the difference on how I was working on the iPad. And as that evolution came, I begin to see more and more power.
My bit of history is I started off using Texas Instruments 99 4A back in 1981 or two.
Oh yeah.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to spend 2 summers working at a company that had its first IBM PCs, ones with the 2 floppy drives and so forth. So I was using DOS back then. When I went to university, it was really mostly about the, Apple Macintoshes, which had just been purchased. We used them heavily, but there were also lots of Windows not Windows at the time, but there were PC programs that we had to use also. This was engineering school, so we had to use both. And when I left, sort of entered industry, the Macintosh was still, or Apple machines were still sort of exotic. So I grew up in the Windows or in the Microsoft ecosystem and never really left. Haven't owned an Apple machine, never, not even a phone. Part of the justification for that is only because I like to test out new apps, and they in the past they always tended to come out on the Windows ecosystem first. And I never wanted to give up the apps that I use because some of them were sort of beta. I guess they were experimental. Given the fact that I like to stay on the cutting edge and test these out, I didn't want to have to go back and use a Mac. Even though over time, eventually, Apple ecosystem, you could use Parallels or whatever program to emulate Windows. I still said, well, why bother? Why bother to go to what I don't have to use? I've always taken this sort of minimalist approach that let me make the most of what I have. And when I get to a really hard stop, then I'll consider moving to something else. But if it's just a matter of a more comfortable operating system, then I won't make a switch for that. It'll have to be something that really stops the show for me because I experience the switching costs as being substantial. So I try to make the most of whatever I'm using in the moment. Sort of try to beat it to death, and then I'll give up. So I'm beating Windows 7 to death at this point.
I think that's a good choice. I mean, again, at the end of the day, a lot of these operating system choices are sort of the natural progression of things, and most people don't choose their operating system, right? Their operating system chooses them, like you said. It's sort of, in school, the computer that you chose and got most comfortable with was the one probably that you ended up using once you left school, and it sort of stuck.
Exactly.
For me, I've had the kind of luxury of always having many different operating systems around me, and so I think very similarly, except for the fact that I've never had to make a choice, I've always had a lot of computers around me, and there were many years of Windows primarily, but I've always had a Windows, Mac, and some flavor of GNU with Linux, sort of an open source operating system available to me. And that's just because I was the area of the world that I was in, where I was working in technology and a legal world. They allowed me to play with technology, and so I did. And so, it was really remarkable for me. I mean, I remember the Macintosh computers in school, and, we really only played games on those. And so, we played games, but I primarily computed on a Windows environment. And so I became very, very, proficient in Windows. And that led me to, being interested in Windows being my primary computer. I think it wasn't until maybe 2011 when I picked up a MacBook Air, the 11-inch, purely for the form factor. I mean, I really didn't buy it for the operating system because, that wasn't my preferred operating system, and it still isn't. I don't particularly have a preference. I think if I have a preference, it probably is to Windows because I'm so, used to it. Although from 95 to, probably XP to Windows 7, that was not that big of an interface change, but now at Windows 8 to 10, there's a substantial interface change, and so even then, I use Windows 10 on a regular basis, but I'm not now using it every day as I do on my travel laptop, which is a 13-inch MacBook Air. And so, there is a bit of upstart cost to getting used to an interface, and when I'm on different keyboards, every time I switch keyboards, even here at my desk, I have to remember, oh right, command isn't on the Windows laptop, and the command, option, control, function keys are different. So there is a little bit of change there, but I'm comfortable with that because I know that I need to know these for being able to do the training that I do for my clients. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way, because I do have to constantly switch gears in my brain in terms of which keyboard and which operating systems and what functions where. Now there's a lot of parity between the two platforms, but there's always that reality.
It is interesting you said that. On my world, it was exactly the opposite. The Play computer was the Windows. That's where you could play, that fantastic game called Test Drive. That was the first car simulator that I remember.
Nice.
And where you could play Police Quest and I'm dating now myself, but that I was trying not to. But it was for me the PC where you go and play, and the Mac was where I do more serious work, and maybe because the software I had available, I remember having PageMaker for the Mac that then allows you to help on and create, we had a little magazine at that time, and it was amazing to be able to design the page in ways that my friends on Windows didn't even dream of with the tools they had available. And I'm sure it's a matter of tools, but it was really cool to be able to get and design our magazine in PageMaker in a way that looks like what we thought at least was a professional magazine.
Yeah, see, and I used to look at the guys playing and gals doing PageMaker work, and I'd be like, why don't you just use Publisher?
Same here.
And again, it ended up being that I was on the wrong side of history, because obviously Publisher hasn't become the standard bearer, and Adobe took over. But but it was one of those things back then, at least. I really didn't see the difference. I didn't see the need for having to switch to another operating system back then. And honestly, I would have. I think that if I had been more thoughtful about it, if I had been more mindful of it, I think I probably would have gotten more proficient in something like PageMaker or another layout, program. And, today I'm a huge open source advocate. So I use Scribus and Inkscape, which are open source layout programs and graphic editing programs, along with GIMP, which is open source equivalent to Photoshop, if you want to call it, something like that. And so, the real problem there, of course, is that those files are open standards, but Adobe products are not going to play well with those ever. So it's always a bit of a bear, is the software you're going to use and the availability of that software on other platforms.
As a fan of software and things, I don't know. I mean, yes, this history right now shows that Adobe may never play simpatico with that. But the reality is, if we have seen in the software world, those giants that suddenly technology change and evolve, and you see them lose an amazing amount of market share. In the recent years, Microsoft is a perfect example of that. If you go back to 2010, that is not that far away, and you ask people, you will ask people in 2010, how do you make a letter? People would look at you and say, well, you use Word. Okay, that was apparently the only software available for the world to make a letter. Because Microsoft not willing to open to the other platforms and not willing to open to have access on the iPads and the Androids and other devices. If you ask that same question to people, there's still people who think Word is the only answer. but that number is a lot smaller than what it was. And even when you look at what a Microsoft package used to cost in 2010 versus what it costs today, you understand how much power Microsoft has lost in these 7 years.
I think that about their hardware as well. I mean, the standard PC today, notwithstanding the manufacturer, the hardware itself they've lost a lot of control there. I think there was once upon a time when Dell was the king of the pond, if you want to, king of the sea. Dell lost a lot there, and no longer do they have that same level of strength when it comes to putting purely Microsoft Windows on every computer that goes out. And obviously Microsoft has made, I think, a lot of really great strides and with the Surface and the Surface Pro. I think that they're fantastic computing devices. It's obviously a high-end market device, so it's not for the faint of heart if you're looking for an inexpensive computing device, but they're great computers. So I think all of the manufacturers and all of the OEMs in that way, including major tech companies that are producing operating systems like Microsoft and Google and Apple and so on and so forth, they all really need to think long and hard about the long tail effect of their users and where their users are going. And that means users are going to need to be able to move from one screen size to another much more fluidly than we do today. So for our listeners, I really think that's a key component to choosing hardware today is the hardware that you're choosing capable of transitioning from one platform to the other. More and more, I find myself gravitating toward using the browser and browser-based software because I know that I'm going to be able to access that same software cross-platform, as opposed to worrying about the operating system itself. I'm able to just worry about getting access to a browser where, I can access the software within the browser. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be more and more evident as we make our way forward. What do you guys think about that in terms of software choices? Do you feel like you lend more to apps on the phone, software on the desktop, or browser-based software for its cross-platform parity, or just for its abilities on your specific platform of choice?
Or just for the safety, the sake of security. Like I said before we started the call, I had to reinstall Windows 7 this week, and it was, anticipated a nasty challenge. It wasn't as bad as I remembered the last time.
Well, that's good.
It took a long time, but I did lose track of some files, and if they were backed up to the cloud, I wouldn't have lost track to them. If I were using them on a browser, I wouldn't have had the problem that I had. So I'm actually migrating, or have decided to migrate as many files as possible to the cloud. I just picked up, I think, Google Drive, because I can sync files to its. I think they give you 100 gigabytes for a couple bucks a month or something like that.
Yep.
But it's inexpensive, and it's secure, and I like Dropbox, but it was way more expensive, and so I'm considering changing the way I use my laptop entirely, so that all of the files that are most critical are either in the cloud or they're about to be in the cloud. Right now, everything that I do that's important is backed up to the cloud using Mozy, but those are mostly security concerns rather than ease of use concerns or concerns about particular features. It's more about security for me. I find that everyone has sort of attained a particular standard of the apps I use. The competitive landscape is sort of level because all of the apps kind of do the same thing. No one stands out as being awesome with respect to the typical Word, spreadsheet, presentation, graphics. They don't stand out enough for me to make a platform decision based on that difference, if you understand what I mean. The differences have become small.
Yeah. They're becoming less and less. I mean, to the point of very minor features. I mean, almost to the extent of what Barry Schwartz talks about in terms of the paradox of choice. It becomes an issue of so many options that we're now nickel and diming over. Well, Apple Pages has this, very minute feature, and Google Docs doesn't. So, I'm gonna hold to this piece of software. It's like, wait, both type, both do fonts, both change, bold, italics, and underline. Really, give me a break.
Right.
Look at the big features and what it can do, and arguing on the margins, I think is a number one problem, I think, of choosing software.
At some point, they're all going to catch up with each other. One will maintain an advantage for a few months, and then they'll add the competitors will add that feature in, and then there goes the advantage. So if you can just be patient enough, I think pretty much all the features in most of the major pieces of software will get there at the same time.
And they'll become cross-compatible. I think, just like Microsoft opened up to the open standards of the ODF, which is the open document format, Google Docs does the same thing with RTF and ODF. And now, I'm sure that Apple Pages, don't hold me to this, but I'm almost sure that it also does, open standards. That kind of opening of the software to be able to be cross-compatible reduces the feeling of wanting to use one piece of software over another and feeling like you're going to be locked into only ever using iCloud, with Apple Pages or Apple Pages on the macOS desktop or whatever,
Eventually, that will be nice. I am stuck on apps at this particular moment. There were two things that happened to me recently. One is I was doing something on the Mac, and I was trying to test a theory. Now the Mac is the playing machine, and I was testing something, and the software I was going to test something says, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And I did not completely read and say, "Okay, continue." And the instruction I was misreading says, "We are going to wipe out your hard drive." Okay, not a great thing. So wipe out the hard drive. The good news was 90% or more, actually. I don't think the amount of files I have on my actual hard drive are just applications, so I didn't lose any files, and I had backup, so it was a matter of the pain of restore than anything else. But that's where, for me, the cloud, it's fantastic, where all the stuff is there and I can go and find it. The second thing, I test recently a Chromebook for a project, and I was quite impressed with the hardware, with the Chromebook, with the Chrome OS. And I even consider, well, this may be, a replacement for my current hardware for my iPad, in the sense, not some of the things, but, for the writing and the day-to-day of the computer and all that. But I found myself tied up. My journal application, my task application, and I basically wasn't willing to have a computer who did not have access to that. So going or adding to this what you were saying earlier about being able to change the screen size, that's one of my favorite features of living on an iOS ecosystem. Doesn't matter if I grab my iPad Pro, or I grab my iPad Mini, or I grab my iPhone, I have exactly the same software, the same tools. I have access the same thing, even if I don't want to. So, for example, I don't see email on my iPhone. I have not done that for years. I'm not interested in look email on my iPhone. But if I need to, all that I need to go is to settings and turn them on.
Something that I'm feeling like is probably a tendency for me as I make my way forward is probably to use the Chrome OS platform more and more. And it's probably similar to you, Augusto, where it's being able to use a similar operating system across, all of your devices. And with Chrome OS, I can use Android applications now within the Chrome OS, and then I'm using the Google Chrome browser as my primary browser anyway most of the time. So it's going to end up. That's sort of where I feel I'm going to go. You and I have had this conversation about getting Chrome OS onto the MacBook, onto the the hardware itself, the Mac hardware, which I would love to be able to do, because then the quality of the Apple hardware and the ability to use Chrome OS on it would be phenomenal. And so I'm sort of interested in that. But I'm at the moment I can't destroy any of my computers. So
well, that is the problem. Actually, since you mentioned that was exactly what deleted my machine, playing that, and mostly because I wanted to have the ability. You can actually get Chrome OS installed into a MacBook. The problem is you cannot do currently dual boot, and that's what I wanted, was to keep Chrome OS on a part of the hard drive, and then Mac OS on the other side of the hard drive, and that's what you cannot do. But you can technically today turn your old or slow Mac OS into a Chromebook that then will give them, will make it super fast again.
And so for listeners, you can also do this to any Windows laptop, any PC laptop that you have hanging around. If you take Chrome OS and put it onto that laptop, you have a new lightning fast computer, because Chrome OS is such a small footprint on that device, and it has to be obviously compatible. You have, obviously the hardware specs have to match, but Chrome OS works on a wide variety of systems. So as long as your processor and hardware are compatible, you can install the operating system on those computers, and it will revive. It'll give new life to a computer that might be a little, several years old and maybe sluggish, using the big bulky Windows, with no disrespect to that. Not that I ever hold punches against Microsoft, but but the reality is that you can actually do that, and for those of you also out there who are thinking hardware and not sure about operating system, I really highly recommend thinking about putting an ISO, the image of the operating system, for Linux Mint or one of those other flavors of Linux. Today, the software parity is there. You can find almost across the board a compatible, alternative that is something that has parity with all of the major, word processing or Office suite. There's LibreOffice, which is a fantastic Office suite. That's an alternative to Microsoft Office, which is not only free software, meaning it is free as in freedom, but it's also no cost, meaning that it is $0 to download and use. And it has a word processor, a spreadsheet workbook software like Excel, a Keynote or PowerPoint alternative, and another application that's sort of like Microsoft Access, where you can develop applications. So in essence, with your browser and that Office suite, you can do most of the productivity software functions, if not more, because there's a lot of software out there for the Linux platform, Linux Mint itself. You really don't have to worry about feeling shut out in that capacity. There are some things like Evernote that you're not going to be able to have on your Linux laptop, because Evernote doesn't produce an official software for that. But there are alternatives. There are unofficial versions of other software that works with your Evernote account, and you can always use Evernote Web and things like that. So I for one, and I'm curious about you guys, about the how wedded you need to be today to hardware. And before you answer that and we close out the conversation, I also wanted to make a note that when Francis was talking about Google Drive, I think it's something that most people don't know, which is that Google Drive is not just going to drive.google.com and accessing your files in the cloud. You also have an application that you can download to your desktop computer, which it could be Windows or Mac, and that desktop computer software is identical to Dropbox. The only difference is that files that are Google specific, Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides, those while you can see them in Google Drive, they don't actually download because they live in the Google Drive on the Google servers. And so when you click on any of those icons in Google Drive, they open in the web browser. But any other file, like a PDF or a Word document where you keep it in its format, or if you're a graphic designer and using InDesign, the INDD file, or an AI file in Photoshop, or whatever it is, the files that are not Google Docs or Google Drive specific, they will be real files that you can open up on your desktop. So it's exactly like Dropbox, with the additional added benefits of being able to open up your Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides, Google Drawing, what have you, in the browser and utilizing them. So if you're thinking about those options, and like Francis said, it's very nominal to have 100 gigabytes worth of additional storage space, and even when you go up to the very large sizes, the prices are still pretty good.
Right. There's a segue a bit to where I think you were going with your comment before talking about Google Drive. That I think there's a sort of a basic set of tools that an individual needs to make sure they have access to. And you were listing off a number of them. And I think there's a distinction. I tried to draw a distinction a few years ago between it's sort of similar to the difference between noise and signal. And what I came away with is that there are features or capabilities that are have to do with productivity, and some that have to do with convenience. And I tried to draw a line between the two and say that which affects my productivity is sort of core. So, for example, having a word processor is core. But having a word processor with maybe 75% of the features that Word offers is probably convenience. More about convenience than productivity. Because I don't use them. Having them, maybe I might use one every 5 years or something. But I think there's a difference between the two. And it came up when I was transitioning from having a feature phone plus PDA to buying a smartphone. So smartphones became the rage, and I was sort of on the sidelines watching and thinking, well, why should I upgrade? And I was a little bit like Augusto. I said, what's the difference between having a knapsack, lots of devices in it, versus having a smartphone? And at the time, as I was sort of investigating and watching people use them, and I was saying to myself, well, it looks as if it's more about convenience for them, because if I carry all of those devices in a knapsack, are they more productive than I am because they're carrying one smartphone? And I said, well, it's more convenient because everything fits into a smaller form factor. But are they more productive? And for a long time, I said, no. And then the first apps started to appear that were useful to me anyway, that crossed capabilities. So they'd use something from like, for example, a phone call would immediately get captured in your contacts, or you could pull up a contact. And so that app actually crossed the capability between the contact manager and the phone app. And that's when I said, okay, well, that's one example of a new productive solution. And I should get a smartphone if I want that particular feature. That's not a matter of convenience. That's a matter of productivity, because now I can do something that I can't do with having a phone over here and a contact database on my PDA over there. So I tried to draw that distinction. I found it kind of helpful in that I pay more attention to core productivity than convenience. I don't know if that resonates at all with your guys' experience.
I'm unfortunately on the opposite side of you and Augusto here, because not because I don't agree. I actually agree with you. It's just that I still carry so many pieces of technology I'm a bit of a technology hoarder in the sense that I still carry my Kindle 3G that I absolutely adore, and I refuse to upgrade to the Paperwhite until it dies, and it still keeps on trucking. And Amazon, keeps sending me these deals, like, hey, if you turn in your Kindle, then we'll, an upgrade to the Paperwhite, then you'll be able to do so. And I'm like, why? It's great. I love this device, and I've had it for years and years and years now, and it just keeps on working. And it's a single function device, meaning that when I'm reading, I'm only reading, and that is highly productive for me. And so I carry my mobile tablet, and I carry two laptops, and I carry, my phone, and I carry all the chargers. And so I am really, really bad about the idea of traveling light when it comes to technology. But I think it's really important to think about form factor, thinking about your health, back health, especially if you are commuting every day and you're carrying quite a substantial weight, especially on one shoulder. That can be very, very bad for your back, especially if you have adult scoliosis or some other kind of lower back issue. Really be conscientious of those kinds of things, because technology doesn't have to be heavy today. You can really get light technology without compromise.
I will love to go hardware independent, mostly because the geek who lives on my heart will love to go and buy, and have on his desk, 3,000 computers. But that said, there are certain key applications or core applications, as Francis called them, that I'm not willing to live without. And if the device, I don't care how cool it is, has not the ability to look at them, then I'm simply not interested. There is 2 or 3 applications that they live on iOS, and for which I depend. One of them is a Scrivener. Scrivener can go into a PC, can go into a Mac or iOS, but it cannot go yet into an Android device. I am not particularly interested on a PC, so if I were to have a different OS, most likely will be Android. So there is that. There is things and OmniFocus are not in Android either. And I use a journaling software that I adore that is called Day One, that it's also not there. And finally, there is 1Password, who, again, can I go around and find a solution? Yes, all of these softwares have equivalents. Someday will come something significantly better and I will leave them behind? Probably. But right now, my ecosystem works in there. We have the family calendar and everything else set up in iCloud. That means if I go to Android, for example, or Chromebooks, I cannot look at my calendars. I cannot go on the family calendars. And that just produce or create problems for me. So right now, the current reality is I'm stuck into something, or a Windows or a Mac or an iOS. The Mac OS, as much as I love it, is an overkill for me. It can do way more than what I need. Then at time what it produces is more distractions than effectiveness. The iOS keep me focused and pretty effective. And as I said, can I work on a Windows? Yes, I can work on a Windows. I did Windows for many years, and I have kept myself up to date because, I coach people who live in Windows. I work with customers who live in Windows, and I deal with businesses who live in Windows. So I want to be proficient, but and maybe because I am proficient, I don't want my own life to be on a Windows computer.
And I can understand that. I mean, the ability to use a platform that is more limited in its, not limited, but more focused in the way in which its user interface is designed, so that you can really be in that like when you're working on iPad, like you are, Augusto, you're working and you have an app open, you know what I mean? And now you can have multiple applications open at the same time. This idea of having multiple apps tasking in front of you is great for being able to take data from one and do something in the other, but you're really forced to focus because it's taken over your entire screen and you're just in that one particular application. So I can see the benefits of that limited focus, or that ability to focus within and on a tablet environment. And I would just say that the big things for me is to have some kind of productivity suite like a Microsoft Office or LibreOffice on the computing device, whatever that might be. In my case, Google Drive on the tablet, and having Google Drive and that accessible across my platforms is my preferred choice. And then some kind of security and backup technology. Now, for those of you who are graphic designers or engineers where you need CAD or something else like that, we are on the precipice of the technology to allow all of these things to be cloud-based. And I'm going to make the prediction that eventually all of these technologies will have either a cloud-based solution or an mobile application, such that the operating system, as we know it from a desktop perspective, will become less and less important, and the browser-based software will become, or the mobile application platform, depending upon what Google does with Andromeda or whatever Fuchsia is going to be. The idea that you're going to basically have the option of using that software platform independent because you can access it from the browser. So with that in mind, I really think that looking for alternatives in the cloud, if you're going to be on multiple platforms, is obviously important, but also if you're going to be on multiple devices, from a phone to a tablet to a laptop to potentially some kind of cross device like a Surface, which is not quite a tablet but not a computer either. It's this sort of intermediary device, convergence device.
Each person has to sort of work out for themselves. There's no one right answer, regardless of what the advertisers might tell you. We're all constructing our ecosystems to serve our peculiar needs. I think, back to what I said before, that if you can separate productivity from convenience and make sure that the productive bases are covered, and then look to convenience as a secondary attribute, I think if everyone could do that, then they would forge the kind of answers that work for them. But it's always going to be an individual solution that fits your particular needs. It's you, your habits, your preferences, your behaviors. But at the same time, you've got to be productive because that's your core, so to speak.
The three of us, while we keep high levels of productivity, have such a different setup, and what Francis says is really the key. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you like or don't like the iOS. What matters is that the tool you're going to use is a tool that is going to allow you to be more productive. And if something changed tomorrow and Windows, by a miracle, comes to produce, more productivity, I will change in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. I think it's important for people to remember that, it's not the hammer and the chisel, but it's the sculptor, skill of the sculptor with whatever hammer and chisel that will allow him or her to create a great piece of sculpture. And I think that's the same with hardware. You can put any hardware in front of us and we're going to make the best use of it. And that's, I think, the most productive perspective when it comes to it, is taking it and molding it to the needs that you have. Because most often than not, people think that because a piece of hardware does or does not have some fancy feature, that they can't be productive. That's not actually the core of what makes you productive. How you approach it, your attitude, and how you utilize it is so much more important. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and we want to hear from you. Let us know about your hardware choices, hardware questions, and your experiences with finding hardware that is productive for your system. Let us know. contact us by going to productivitycast.net/contact and let us know. We really appreciate and look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you to Francis Wade for joining us here on this episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. I'm Ray Sidney Smith with Augusto Pinaud. Here's to your productive life.
That's it for this episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity, with your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.